Hi and welcome to another edition of ChinnyVision. This time it's an isometric shooter on your 8-bit. If you say isometric shooter, of course you think of Zaxxon. It's a 1982 arcade game by Sega, accused by some of being a little bit shallow and perhaps being more about looks over actual gameplay. But we're going to look at it on three systems: the Commodore 64, the Atari 8-bit and the MSX. Starting off on the Commodore 64 here. I assume this version's hacked because it says welcome to the first version of Zaxxon with the second level. So I assume something's gone on here with a subsequent release that's been missing different bits. So you fly along, you can go up or down, and as I say, it's isometric, so you're shooting at this peculiar angle. It's not full 3D, it's 2D graphics drawn to be like 3D, and that sounds a little bit odd. But if you think about games like Head Over Heels, there's at least you've got the grid of the ground to give you an idea it's actually full 3D. Arcade version here on the right against the Commodore 64 on the left. So you can see the arcade version a little bit more complex, a little bit more colourful graphics, but the scrolling speed's about the same. You have to shoot the fuel depots to get more fuel. And I don't know why these enemy bases have these walls you've got to fly through. And as you go through the levels, little gaps in the walls get narrower. And it can be quite difficult, unlike games like Head Over Heels, where you've got that grid on the ground to judge yourself against. It can be quite difficult to see your exact position. You've got the shadow, but when you're moving up and down, it just makes it a little bit more difficult. It has to be said, this is a very solid port here on the Commodore 64. My problems with it are actually problems that Zaxxon in the arcade has. It simply wasn't one of the best games around at the time. It looked great, but never really played as well as other games. After you've gone through that strip of land or whatever it is that you have to shoot, I'm not quite sure what it is, floating spacecraft, you have to go through this space battle sequence, and it can be quite difficult to shoot the baddies because again you're going up and down left and right and judging that height precisely, especially now you don't have any shadow, can be quite difficult. Sound effects are limited to engine noises and beeps for shooting. Very simple, no music, but the arcade version didn't have that either. So here's one of these narrow wall sections I was talking about. Very difficult to judge. It's a very solid port here on the C64, and that's going to get even more difficult to go through. They've got through there. And so it's a very solid port here on the Commodore 64. Slightly muted palette as you'd expect. Not quite as nice as the arcade in terms of the level layouts, could be a little bit more detailed, but you know, it's all here. The problems here are the problems the arcade original had. Moving over to the MSX, the first thing that strikes you is it's more colourful than the Commodore 64 version, but we've got this very jerky scrolling. Your spacecraft and some of the other enemies that fly about are actually sprites, so they're very, very smooth, and there's no colour clash here on the MSX, which indeed confirms the main player aircraft is a sprite. And once you get over this jerkiness, it actually plays quite well. The colour scheme is very close to the arcade original. Landscape's not quite as detailed. It's a curious contrast to play a game where the main player sprite moves so smoothly and the landscape jerks across. You have to get used to it. And once you do get used to it, it's actually a really decent conversion. Sound effects are the same as the Commodore 64 version, really. As I say, there's no music. So you just got the aircraft noise and the beeps and explosions. Level layout seems to be slightly different, or that might just be the way the MSX screen looks. The shadow from the aircraft seems to appear and disappear when you go over things, which is a little bit annoying. Into the space section here, and this is a little bit easier than the Commodore 64 version. Just seems to be slightly easier to hit the enemies and avoid their fire. There also seems to be a lack of the fuel, whatever they are, spacecraft that fly across in this space section here on the MSX. So slightly different level layout here from the C64, slightly wider gap in that wall there. My shadow reappears again there. That enemy there is definitely a spike, because it's moving smoothly. I just find this whole thing of the jerkiness of the background and the main sprites moving around so smoothly just a weird thing to see. And it's just a hardware limitation of the MSX, and I promise you, once you start to play this game, you do get round it, but it's an odd thing to look at for the first time. Overall, the MSX, it's a really good port. Plays well, very colourful. Nice to see the MSX hardware sprites being used, and as I say with the Commodore 64, that any problems with it are the problems with the main Zaxxon arcade game. If anything, this version is easier than the Commodore 64 version. Now at this point, MSX fans will be screaming at the screen, "Hey Chinny, there's 2 versions of Zaxxon for the MSX," and they'd be quite right. The version we're looking at here was released in Europe and I believe the USA on tape, and is a port of the ColecoVision version of the game. The ColecoVision version runs a little bit faster, but otherwise it seems to be a fairly faithful port. The other version of the game we're looking at here, briefly emulated, the version we're looking at here is actually a port of the Sega SG-1000 version of the game, and was released on cart in Japan, and also managed to find its way into Europe on cart as well. This is emulated, unfortunately, because I don't have a cart to run here on my MSX. It's quite a bit slower, but has more detailed graphics than the version we've been looking at that plays from tape. Other than that, it's a pretty faithful conversion of the SG-1000 version, really. But as I say, I can't really look at this cartridge version because I can't run it on real hardware. Here we are on the Atari, and we've got the full hardware sprites and hardware scrolling, so much smoother than the MSX, and just like the Commodore 64, but with slightly brighter colours. Everything's very fluid, just lacks the detail on the landscape. Well, that was quite short. As I say, that lacks some of the detail on the landscape that the MSX and arcade version has. But that level seemed incredibly short there. And over to the space section. And this is actually harder than the Commodore 64 version once you get to the space section. It's, I think, harder to judge where the bullets are and where the other spaceships are. It's not going well for me here, unfortunately, and I've been killed again. It's a game over. So, of the 3 versions, the Atari version is definitely the hardest. I'm not sure if it's the lag from playing this on capture, or if it is just harder, but it seems to be a degree up from the other 2 versions. But it looks attractive and it plays well. All in all 3 of these versions are definitely worth playing. Commodore 64 version is a solid conversion, slightly muted colours, lacks a little bit of that detail from the arcade version, but it's smooth and it plays really well. The MSX, once you get over that initial shock of the jerky scrolling on the landscape, plays really, really well. A little bit easier than the other versions, which I think is a good thing. I certainly got further in the game on that version. The Atari version is definitely the toughest of the 3, but it's a very solid conversion nevertheless. I think some of those levels are slightly shorter than the arcade or the C64 and MSX versions, but it's still a very solid conversion on the Atari.